Okay. This next part. Creationism. This passage talks about creation, and there's lots of different views regarding how the world was made and the origins of the world. The most conventional view held by most scientists is one that does not include God in its thinking at all. I hold personally that to a what you would call a young Earth creation view, and we'll discuss why in just a second. 2 Peter 3:3-6. Knowing this first, scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their lust, saying, "Where's the promise of his coming? Since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation." There's all things are just a one uniform thing. For this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. In other words, one of the signs of the last days is denial of the global flood. One of the signs of the last days is to say that everything just continues as it always has. It's important though to state, different intelligent people who love and follow Jesus can have different opinions on this topic. This is not what you would call salvific. It doesn't, this is not a hill to die on. This is not your salvation doesn't rest on it. However, it can affect the way that you interpret the rest of the Bible. How you look at the first part of Genesis can influence how you look at the entire Bible. Let's gather up a few definitions. Big old words, hang in there with me. Uniformitarianism. That is the conventional geologic view. It says that the history of the world consists of one long uniform thing, that it is the same. The processes that form the fossils are the same as the processes that you find now. It's uniform throughout history. Catastrophism is a view that would say that the Earth's history has been dominated by one or more specific catastrophes. Now that doesn't mean that someone who mass extinctions they might believe something in parts of that in a uniform thing, but they wouldn't say that there was a global flood, for example. They would deny a global flood, whereas a catastrophist would say no, that's what it looks like. It's important for us to understand the natural, the things that work every day, that we see every day, that we can test using the scientific method, versus the supernatural, God at work, outside of space and time, in a different way. We can test ongoing processes. We can put them to a test. We can put them under a microscope. We can repeat them. But a historical event, you can't test that way. You gather evidence. You make a hypothesis and you test the evidence against that hypothesis. But you can't test it in the same way that you would using what is normally called the scientific method. The scientific method, you make a hypothesis, you figure out a way to test it, and then you test it and repeat it, and you have to give it others. The legal method is where you get witnesses to ascribe to it. Natural selection. This is a weird one because there's been some misunderstanding on this one. Natural selection is actually something that nobody should have a problem with. Christian, non-Christian, creationist, non-creationist, whatever. All it is that nature works on populations of critters. That if you have a population of critters and their environment changes, then it may favor part of that population over another. The classic example is black moths and white moths. And if they're in an area where the tree bark is white, then the white moths hide from the birds better, so you get more white moths. If the tree bark then becomes darkened by the coal, then you get black tree trunks, and the black moths do better. No problem. Natural selection is not an issue. Nobody serious denies that. The issue becomes whether the variation of black versus white moths and things like that, whether there's boundaries on it versus wide open boundaries from one to the next to a next to a next, where a moth can change into a cricket, can change into a spider, whatever. Are there boundedness to the variations, or just unbounded change? In terms of looking at origins, this is going to be like a menu. And you can pretty much find somebody who chooses each item on the menu a la carte. Young Earth and universe versus old Earth and universe. Or sometimes young Earth, old universe. But, you'll find, people that will choose either one of those. A local flood, that the flood in Genesis as described, it was local only to that area, versus a global flood. We'll talk about that next week. Evolution, going from one thing to the next, species changing to different species, families to families, or created kinds. And a kind is different than a species, but a created kind may have a lot of variation with it. You could think of a dog kind. There's everything from Ernie's little tiny little mini micro dogs to real dogs. Naturalistic evolution, in other words, it was the clock was wound up and it just let go naturally, versus theistic evolution. God had his hand in each step. And here's an important one. Did Adam and Eve really, literally exist? Or is this just a moral story? So we have the different variations, and you'll find people that you can find an old Earth, local flood, created kinds, natural. You can select them like a la carte menu to find the variations in origin beliefs. One of the things for us to understand is, what would a worldwide flood look like? What would that be like? It would have huge waves. It would have what is called, it's been modeled by the people at Institute for Creation Research using a small supercomputer. And they discovered that it would have what you would call hypercanes, hurricanes that are so strong, they're way off the scale of what we call hurricanes, hypercanes. Gigatons plus, gigantic amounts of sediment moved from place to place. Huge amounts of movement. Huge currents around in things. It's not the same all over the world, though, because there'd be a wide variation of conditions, including very still regions. You'd expect some places to be all churned up and other places to be still. And that can create different effects. For instance, a still region can be used to create things like chalk beds and things like that, where a more turbulent current can be used to create something like the Grand Canyon layers. The important thing is to come to the evidence on is that either a worldwide flood would leave evidence. That the fossils are either old, with evidence of millions of years, or they're young, with evidence of a global flood. You can't. The fossils are either evidence of a global flood, or they're evidence that the Earth is millions of years old. They're not both. They can't be both. Geologists try to date things. They use carbon dating, carbon-14 dating. They're looking for one type of element that changes into another element. They use various types of radiometric dating, 5 different types of radiometric dating. And they've used these to try to date rocks and artifacts. There are, however, assumptions that go into all of these dating methods. One of them is that the decay rate is constant. That sounds reasonable, right? That the radioactive element has had a steady rate of decay over time. Well, it turns out it ain't necessarily so. That was just assumed, has been assumed as a constant, but there is a really good project called the RATE project, RATE project, that has been going into this and can demonstrate evidence that the rate of decay is not constant.
What changes it? The temperature, climate?
It seems like it's faster, older, and it's been winding down,
Okay, so time.
getting slower.
In
Yeah.
other words, it's not a steady decay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that assumes is that the rocks being measured have had no disturbance, presumably in some cases for millions of years, that they've just been sitting there. Nothing coming in, nothing going out. And that they know how much is of the two elements that they're measuring at time equals 0. That they're assuming that there's no daughter element, if you will, at time equals 0. And this is especially a problem for carbon dating. Carbon dating really isn't much good for fossils or things like that because it only goes back to about 10,000 to 50,000 years, period. But it assumes that the rate of formation and decay of carbon-14 is constant, that you know what that ratio is, and then you're looking for the decay afterwards. It turns out if you measure that rate, that it is not constant. For it not to be constant, the Earth has to be young. That if the Earth was over 10,000 years old, that rate would be constant. The other thing to understand when you're talking about creationism is how fossils are dated. We talk about dating mythologies, but those are almost never used when dating rocks. The way fossils are dated is they assign a date based on the fossils that they find in the
Surrounding.
let me go. There we go. They do it based on what they call the geologic column. Okay, the geologic column is a construct. It is not really found in its full expression any place on the world, but they find a piece of it here, a piece of it there, a piece of it here, and then they put those pieces together. And the way they date fossils is they look for what they call index fossils that are in that strata, in that hunk of rock. If they find that index fossil, then they say, okay, it must be that part of the geologic column. But if you think about it, how do they know what the age of the index fossil is? The age of the index fossil is because it's in that rock. It's a circular reasoning.
Which they can carbon date.
No.
They can't
Carbon date doesn't go back that far. Carbon date doesn't go back that far, and there's serious issues with the other dating methods. We're not going to get much deeper than what this is, during tonight because of limited time. But the point is that the column is an artificial construct. They're trying to grapple with and understand geology, but it's put together, and the way the fossils are dated is because of the types of fossils that they find, the index fossils that they find. And so it's a circular reasoning type of argument. Okay, so other issues in terms of design is that we have an amazing design biologically. I can't emphasize that. Man has not made a single machine that can build a copy of itself. Every one of our cells do it. It is amazing, the design. At the time of Darwin, they had no idea how complex things were. In fact, there are fascinating quotes about, if things were much more complex, we would have a harder time describing it happening this way. But, we now know amazing design. Consistencies of design are evidence of a common designer, not necessarily evidence of a common development. In fact, you have to have certain consistencies for the biosphere to be compatible within itself, for the animals and critters to be able to eat each other and to be able to be around each other. One of the biggest problems for evolution biologically is coming up with are we talking about natural selection? Well, how do you get enough of a variation for evolution to work on it? How do you get that variation? There is a wonderful book called The Edge of Evolution. Now, this guy is not a creationist. a guy in favor of intelligent design, but not a creationist. He demonstrated that single gene mutations are rare but possible. Multiple gene mutations are almost unheard of. This is actually why things like the HIV cocktail, the cocktail to fight AIDS, has been so effective, because the viruses can mutate to fight one drug, but not to be immune to one drug, but not a cocktail of drugs. There is a known issue with mutations that is called mutational loading. Mutations tend to load on a critter, and mutations almost to 100%, 99.9999%, are negative. Even when they do something good, like a bacteria that confers, I'm immune to this one drug, there's a negative consequence that comes along with it. And mutational loading is that mutations that they add up to be bad. And we have found that our DNA has a marvelous ability to fix itself, to repair itself. And that tends to put a bound on creation. Because if your DNA can't change to a different kind, if it has a ability to repair itself, and there's a whole new study of science in DNA repair. They've learned that some of the stuff they thought were junk DNA is actually stuff that God has put in there to help DNA repair itself, checksums in the code, if you will. We also have an interesting issue in biology, and that is that we're finding in these fossils DNA in soft tissue for dinosaurs. They broke open a fossil, and inside they found soft tissue that wasn't fossilized yet. That only takes a few thousand years. It doesn't, the fact that it was still there was evidence of an extremely young fossil and is a real problem. DNA is supposed to degrade to zero in under 10,000 years, and the fact that we have been able to extract real DNA strands is like indicative that no, this isn't millions of years old. It hasn't decayed to that. There is a basic, but to geological issues, there is a basic principle of geology, and that is, it kind of makes sense, it's a principle, that they assume it, that if you have a layer of rock that, unless something weird happens, a layer on top of it is newer and younger than the layer below it. Makes sense, and that they use that, they call it superposition. And so when they look at like the Grand Canyon, they would say that these layers are built up one after another, and the older layer is at the bottom and the younger layer is at the top. It makes sense, but Dr. Guy Berthold came along, and this guy figured out and did tests, and he was able to show that it is totally bizarre and not what you would expect. In a flood state, in a state where you have dissolved solids in a flood, that the layers deposit themselves sideways. That the entire column of layers all happens at the same time, and then it's deposited sideways. And he took a whole bunch of sandstone and a particular set of layers. He ground them up and was able to show that they sorted themselves right back out into that same set of things. And it wasn't just coarse to finer like you would expect in still water. It was a jumbled up mixture of things. And I do it as an experiment, as a demonstration in the summer camp, that we take a bunch of different gravel and rocks and dirt, and we pour it into an aquarium with a bunch of running water, and sure enough, the entire column, as it were, the entire geologic column is built at the same time. You have all these different layers, and you get fine layers mixed in with thicker layers. They're not just one after the other. One of the big problems for geologists is what they call out-of-order layers. Layers where supposedly you have this on top of that, but this is identified by the index fossils as being older than this one. Happens all the time. And so they have language to describe it. They call them overthrusts or underthrusts. and they will talk about one moving on top of the other. Happens all the time, though. And there are some real big ones with real problems. One of the biggest is called the Lewis overthrust. It's several miles thick, several hundred miles wide. And supposedly it moved 50 miles over a very soft shale layer, thick layer, with minimal evidence of grinding. So gigatons plus of rock supposedly moved one over the other without any evidence that there was grinding between them. Nope. Now, it's no problem for a creationist, for a global flood, to have layers. We would expect it to be jumbled up in places. We expect there to be the currents. We'd expect there to be the differences in different areas. Another problem is fossils that are put where you don't expect them, in the wrong layer, if you will. Again, happens all the time. The geologic column is not this nice, neat thing that the pictures might make you think of it as. It's jumbled up amazingly. And so they have a whole set of words to describe that. Downwash, infiltration, contamination, reworking, where supposedly an older fossil got washed down into the younger fossil and then it reformed around it. But they don't have any evidence that the rock was reformed. They just have this fossil that is not where it belongs, and it can't be there, of course, so they have to make that assumption. Here's a fun one, and it has some disputation, okay? Out-of-place artifacts. There are some amazing artifacts. Go on ahead and look at it on the web. There are things like finely made crafted bells and hammers and things like that are obviously man, that are found in places like coal that are supposed to be millions of years old. That they're found when supposedly there isn't supposed to be guys around to make them.
That was in
What
South
do they
Africa.
explain that as? How do they explain that?
Mostly they try to call it fraud.
Oh. Okay.
Other than that, they also call it downwash, infiltration, contamination, reworking. They try it,
That's
but
just a word. How do they try to explain it?
yeah, they try to just say that,
But they also say that alternative history, that it could be that the Earth has been here millions of years, and that man may have existed longer
And then died out.
than
and
what
came up
our current philosophy is.
well, yeah, then you have some other real problems.
They found footprints and
I know.
and hard rock or something.
They found footprints, overlapping dinosaur footprints, for example, in Texas. And it's like, okay, so did man exist at the same time as dinosaurs?
You're doing the Texas two-step.
Exactly. And actually, I would say, yes, man did exist at the same time as dinosaurs. Here's some theological issues that are revolved around the different types of creationism, and especially creation versus evolution. Is you have death before sin. If we evolve and had death, you have death before sin occurring. One issue that people say is, well, the universe and the earth appear to be old, and they have a problem with that. They would say that that would make God a liar if the universe appeared to be old and it isn't. I don't have a problem with it because I look at Adam. How old was Adam when he was first created? A day. Yeah, first day he was a day old. How old did he look? He was a full-grown man. He created a man and a woman, not a baby. I have no problem with God creating a stable universe. Now, there are other cool ways of looking at it. There's some cool scriptures about God stretching out the heavens, and some people have gone into trying to calculate that, because if you stretch space, there's a time effect as well. Some people go with it that way. You have a theological issue if you go with Adam as a story. Romans 5 builds a case of him as one man, and Jesus came along as one man to take care of the sin. God stretches out the heavens. Job 40:41 do appear to reference dinosaurs in the Bible, and it's like, yeah, Leviathan and Behemoth. And people try to say, no, those are just rhinoceroses or elephants or something, but
Breathing fire?
it doesn't quite work. Whereas dinosaurs do make sense. To a creationist, they would say, no, a dinosaur was around at the same time as man, not an issue. The tracks, not an issue because of that. But that's a radically different time scale. Things created according to their kind. The word for that is baramin. And there is a whole class of people who are trying to classify and identify the different kinds, to identify those boundaries that God has put in. And there's been a lot of work working that. It's not the same as kingdoms and species. Finally, there is a word that is used in Genesis 1, the word yom. And that's a Hebrew word that is usually translated day, can be translated age. And so you get people who would say that, okay, the ages, the days in Genesis are actually, instead of day 1, it was age 1. There's some real problems with that, especially when you look at morning and evening. The first day, evening and morning. I'm sorry, it always moves from dark to light, disorder to order. And when it is combined with a number throughout Scripture, it always means a literal day. If you try to make Genesis 1 ages, then you have some real other issues, like plants would exist for a long time before you had the sun and the moon, and that would be a little bit problem for the plants. And you have things like the Lord saying, in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, and using that is why we have the Sabbath day. He rested on the 7th day. For more reading in creationism, I suggest a couple of places. There's lots of different places with lots of different opinions. These are young earth places. One of them answers in Genesis. That's a more popularized type thing. Institute for Creation Research is a more technical, peer-reviewed journals, that kind of thing. And I like both of them because they're both able to admit, we're still investigating this. This is a problem for us. For example, one of the issues for creationists is after the flood, you have Noah and the ark. How many different animals and critters were actually on the ark? How did they get dispersed over the earth? How exactly did that work? How did you get the variations that we see now within each kind? How did you get all the different dogs? How did you get all the different, butterflies, whatever the kinds are? How did you get that so quickly? And so they're investigating that and doing studies and research to try to figure that out.